This Enlightenment mindset, and this is precisely the thing, it seems to me, that needs to be let go of, melted. So many good things came out of it, but it is what's killing the planet. This notion of other, of control, of objectifying, of rationalising. I'm absolutely not saying we don't need science. It's more the attitude that we bring, not the technology itself, but the attitude we bring to it. And I feel this huge thirst for depth that the rational approach cannot give us.
I suppose a lot of people want the benefits of spirituality without the institutional religion, but can you have it one without the other? I don't know.
Well,
hello and welcome to today's edition of Re-Enchanting from Seen and Unseen. I'm Justin Brierley.
And I'm Belle Tindall.
And this is the show where we bring you interesting conversations with people from all different walks of life, but essentially look at how we can re-enchant a largely post-Christian, secular, material world with the Christian vision of reality. And very much looking forward to doing that with our guest today, aren't we, Belle?
We so are. Today we are joined by Dr. Claire Gilbert. Hello.
hello.
So Claire is an author, lecturer, mentor and retreat leader. She was the founding director of the Westminster Abbey Institute. She writes and speaks about ethics and spirituality in politics, in public service, medicine and ecology. She is the author of some beautiful books, including Miles to Go Before I Sleep, Letters on Hope, Death and Learning to Live, and her most recent publication, which she very handily has before here.
And a beautiful cover.
A beautiful cover, which is Julian, which we will be speaking about today, a novel about the medieval mystic Julian of Norwich.
Yeah, so today we're going to be re-enchanting. Well, what do you re-enchant? Because it's such an enchanting subject to begin with. You can't exactly say you're re-enchanting Julian of Norwich, but perhaps re-enchanting earthly realities with sort of heavenly visions and things is part of what we're doing today. So welcome along.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Before we talk about Julian of Norwich, we are sitting on top of a library. And so our signature question for every guest is, what have you been reading lately?
Well, I've just finished Isabel Allen's House of Spirits, which is not for the faint-hearted. And so I'm now reading The Young Visitors by Daisy Ashford. Daisy Ashford is 8 years old, and it's utterly charming, illustrated by Posy Simmons. I'm also reading a friend's doctorate on disability because of the writing I'm doing at the moment. So there's a mixture of heavy and absolutely charming and light.
That really is a mixture.
That's very nice. What is the book by the young girl about?
Well, I'm only a little way into it, but she's describing a gentleman who's very fat, who has a lady staying with him called Ethel, and the gentleman whose name I can't remember, and the lady go to visit another gentleman who's very tall. And I think what's going to happen is that the very tall gentleman and Ethel are going to fall in love, and the fat gentleman is going to get very jealous.
Okay.
Yes.
Right, well,
Sorry about spoilers, everybody, but everything about that is so. Even Daisy and Posy.
Yes.
How quaint is that? Daisy and
nice.
Everything about that is beautiful. You're right. We cannot possibly re-enchant Julian of Norwich. Julian of Norwich re-enchants everything else.
She does.
She does. There's so much I want to get into. I'm quite a newcomer to Julian of Norwich. I've only just started reading here, so I'm particularly excited that you're here. But I think I've read that you have called here your bright star amidst a quite... I'm scared to say the words, but I'm quoting you, dull Oxford theology degree.
Yep.
Did you call it dull as dust?
I think I said it was a dusty.
Oh, dusty. There you go.
I probably said dull.
Okay, dusty. Can you tell us who is Julian of Norwich for anyone who that name does not ring any bells at all, and what made her your bright star?
So she is... Actually, there's quite a lot of mystery about who she is, but we think she is the author of a wonderful text called Revelations of Divine Love. in which she talks about having visions in May 1373. She talks about herself as a woman. And we believe that after she had these visions, she entered an anchor hold, which is a cell, a room attached to a church in Norwich, and stayed there for the rest of her life. And from legacies, we know that she lived till at least 1416. So a long life lived in this cell. And we imagine in that cell, she reflected on her visions and wrote about them there. So a medieval mystic, and there are a few of them around. And there was this term in Oxford, in the Oxford theology degree, where you could look at medieval mystics. Actually, it was a special subject. It wasn't core to the curriculum. And that was the best term in the whole 3 years. And Julian was the best of the bunch. And the reason was her writing is so alive. And she doesn't try to organise God. Can I put it like that? And so many theologians do just that. She has these visions. They don't make a huge amount of sense. They are full of beauty and wonder and extraordinariness. And she doesn't try and organise it and get rid of the bits that don't fit. She doesn't try and draw conclusions. She muses on them at great depth and length, but she doesn't try and sort it all out for you. So you're left with this wonderful open-ended sense. And indeed, she says, right at the end of the book, she says, this book is not yet performed. God will have you see more. And she says, don't look at me. This is not about me. Look at what I saw. So she puts herself next to her readers, and we all have the chance to have the direct encounter ourselves. It's so alive in that way. And these other writings just weren't.
And relatively unusual to have something from a woman of that day and age. Yes. I mean, most of, obviously, certainly Christian writings that have come down through the centuries have been male. So I suppose that sort of sets it apart as well, hearing from a female voice. Yeah. But I suppose I want to know, was this sort of something people did? Was this a kind of career you could effectively do, sort of lock yourself up in a cell for decades on end and just muse on God? Or was this kind of weird then as well?
Now, yes. Not that weird. So, the tradition of becoming a hermit goes back in the Christian tradition. It goes back forever, but in the Christian tradition to St. Anthony of Egypt, who left the city in the 4th century and went into the desert. So there's been that strand all the way through. And also the contemplative active with Mary and Martha. So that's even in the Bible. And we know there were anchorites, men and women, from at least the 12th century or 13th century, because there's a document called the Anchorina Wis, which is a guide written by a man for anchoresses, as it happens, which is where the idea that Julian had a cat. There's this idea Julian had a cat. We don't know if she had a cat, but in this Anchorina Wis, which is a guide, it's not a rule, it's a guide, it says if you can have a cat, presumably to deal with the mice. So that's 12th century. And then in Julian's day, at the second half of the 14th century, there were, I think, 2 or 3 anchorites in Norwich. In the 15th century, there were about 50. So one can't help wondering whether she influenced that because we know she became famous. And so it did start a bit of a trend. So you can imagine Norwich, every church had their hermit, which is rather wonderful, isn't it? To have someone attached to your church. Just
their local hermit.
Yeah, taking part.
Yeah. Can you, I always knew, I didn't always know, but when I started reading Julian of Norwich, I knew that she lived in a cell on the side of a church. But when I read actually what that meant, and in your book as well, I actually got palpitations because, the door is actually bricked up.
Yes.
She really is completely confined. And you write this beautiful thing about her hearing people. So, she's in the cell gets bricked up, then she's in it. And on the other side, she can hear people, or she assumes she can hear people leaving the church.
I could read it to you if you like.
Please.
It won't take very long.
No, please
but
do.
It does give you a feeling of,
it absolutely does.
The experience of going into church. So she... So when you going into the cell, that is, when you become an anchorite, when the ritual that accompanies you is the Requiem Mass. It's your death. And you die to the world and you enter, so the cell is your coffin. And indeed, there's some evidence that you lie down and earth is thrown on you as if you were lying in your coffin, and we throw earth on the body in the coffin. And the Requiem Mass would have happened in the church with a congregation, and she would have gone down the steps into her cell. And as the Dies Irae is being chanted, the cell door is bricked up. Now, this is my imagination of what happened to Julian of Norwich, but there are lots of accounts of this, and somebody has recreated a Requiem Mass of this nature. So it's based on a bit of research as well. So this is the moment, and it was very important to me to try and make sense of what Julian did to a 21st century ear. It is weird. You go into a cell. But she really wanted to be on her own, to reflect on her visions. She didn't want to be a householder. The thought of being a nun wasn't appealing because it wasn't going to give her the space and time and freedom to reflect. And if you think of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, is very much in that. And I think it's plausible to think that there weren't that many options open to women. And Julian did have a task here, and she needed to be left alone. Also a dangerous task, because she was going to be reflecting on visions which were possibly heretical. So she needed to be in a place where she wasn't going to have someone looking over her shoulder all the time. So here we are. This is the moment. The cantor completes the terrible chant, Pie Jesu Domine, dona eis requiem, Amen. Merciful Lord Jesus, grant me rest, Amen. Stillness. There's a quiet rustling of clothes and patter of feet as the people leave the church. Then the thin cry of a baby rises, piercing the silence. Is it a cry of pain, or for new life, or both? The cry leaves the church with the people, and silence returns. I rise and release the curtain over the squint, and I turn to face my cell, my coffin, my small home. I have never felt so fully alive. I am not expecting this. I was expecting to feel tortured by confinement at this moment, as the portal is bricked up, the impervious walls pressing upon me like the walls of my home in the city, my breath short and shallow, and panic only just kept under control. But the panic I felt when I first kneeled has gone. At last, I'm alone. I'm at home. My breath is deep and satisfying, like drinking delicious clean water and slaking a thirst I hardly knew I had. I stand in the vast space that feels like the cathedral, made bigger, not smaller by the walls, and it is all my own. Grateful relief floods through me like a balm. At last, I can ask the world to recede, and it will. All I have to do is to close the curtain, and I will be left in peace. I reach with careful fingertips and touch the east wall where my altar stands beneath my crucifix, towards the dawn, towards new life, towards God. There is nothing now between me and God. No thing. I kneel and weep tears of joy and speak words of thanks for the time that is granted me here, now. Time and space and strength for the long, slow, interior journey deep into God, God deep into me. I have come home.
Wow.
And all of that sounds, reading those lines, I was panicking because I was like, I had this vicarious claustrophobia, because all of that sounds so weird and like something you would never want to do until she thinks the line, finally I can tell the will to recede and it will. And all of a sudden you think, oh, if I could get anything, that is exactly what I want. I want to be able to tell the will to recede and know that it will. And then all of a sudden, Julian of Norwich, literally bricking herself into a cell, makes complete sense.
I'm so glad to hear it. And if I may say so, I think it's particularly women who get this.
Oh, is it?
It's so often we who feel burdened by, even today, by so many responsibilities and so many cares and things to think about and people to look after and demands. Being left alone is just brilliant.
Heaven.
I'm so glad you got it.
You must feel a bit like you have almost at some points become Julian of Norwich, though. You've obviously entered into this. You've decided to write a first-person novel rather than a biography. So what was that process like? Why have you chosen that particular format rather than the traditional biography?
Yes, well, there was a bit of a journey. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I have a cough. My voice is not good. There was a bit of a journey leading up to it. As I say, I fell in love with Julian at Oxford. Many years later, I was given the opportunity to write a doctorate about her in relation to the ecological crisis. And I defended that thesis in 2018. The next year, I was diagnosed with myeloma, a cancer of the blood. And I started to write letters to my dear friends, my dear readers, about it. I said, this is how I can cope with my cancer treatment, because it was 2.5 years of really, really grueling treatment. And so they were my companions. But more than anything, Julian became my companion. So she stopped being the subject of my academic study and became my spiritual guide. And she helped me. You would know this from the Revelations, and certainly in the story I tell. She helped me to face and forgive pain, to walk towards it, to receive it, to smile at it. And I would dress up to go to chemotherapy knowing I was going to feel so awful afterwards. But just this, open your heart to it. And it felt like a kind of counterintuitive triumph. There's no sense of battle. It's a receiving, even being grateful for it. And Julian taught me that. So at the end of this 2.5 years of treatment, I think I would say this: I heard a call to tell her story. With the voice that I discovered in writing about the cancer. So I've written all these other books about ethics, but this was searingly honest and vulnerable, this voice I found. Because I was writing to my friends, I wasn't thinking about publication. It was only subsequently that we thought it mightn't be a bad idea to publish, and that was scary because I was so vulnerable in the letters. But it was my voice, and so this call to tell her story was somehow to tell her story with that same voice. And as a homage to her. But I didn't know if she would let me, if I can put it that way, because she really doesn't want to be known. She makes that quite clear in the text. And as a matter of fact, we don't know very much about her. So it was going to have to be an act of imagination. Yeah. So I started, and I tell you, the thing poured out of me, and it was like prayer. Writing it was like prayer. I would go deep inside myself. And what emerged was so much of me and of her. I mean, I knew her text really, really well because of the doctorate. But it's true that you can't, and I can't really tell where Julian stops and I start, or vice versa. And this is my spirituality that's being expressed in the book.
I was going to say, where does Claire stop and Julian begin? But you took the words out of my mouth. Yeah. I mean, was there anything you kind of directly took from that experience of the grueling cancer treatment that you sort of found a place in Julian's story specifically? Yes,
I would say so, particularly when I have to relive her visions in order to tell them as well as she tells them, which I can't actually. I hope reading that book gets people reading hers. But one of the visions, the 8th vision, she has she has Christ. So she has a crucifix before her. She's very, very ill. She's sitting up in bed, dying. She feels numb from the feet up to her waist. She's sitting up because her breathing is very laboured. And the curate has come and he's holding the crucifix before her. He's at the foot of her bed. So she's had her eyes like this, looking to heaven where she thinks she's going. And he says, "Look upon thy Saviour and comfort thee, thyself." So that's what she does. She fixes her eyes on the crucifix, and that's where the visions happen, on the crucifix. So the 8th vision is Christ on the cross, dying. And she describes it it's been called painterly detail. It's extraordinarily powerful, her description.
Good word, painterly.
Yeah, and it's not morbid, but it is, you really see in the colours and the drying flesh like tanned leather waving in the wind. And it's really remarkable description. And she asks to have experience the pain herself. And she is granted that wish. And it's the worst pain in the world and worse. And so trying to enter into that experience myself, I didn't suffer pain like that in the cancer treatment, but it was absolutely terrible. And I did feel as though I was going to die sometimes, particularly the stem cell transplant, where they do nearly kill you because they take all your stem cells away, all your bone marrow away, and give you your stem cells back. And there's this period where you're so neutropenic is the word, that even your own bacteria is poisonous to you. Wow. So you're under constant supervision in isolation, which fits with Julian. Yeah. With antibiotics on standby at all times in case things go really bad. And 10% of people end up in intensive care, and 2% of people die from this. Wow. So it does take you right to the edge. So very much these things spoke themselves or wove themselves into the narrative.
Because there's, like you say, there's so little we know about Julian of Norwich. In fact, as I'm sure people know, we don't know her real name. Julian of Norwich is because she was attached to the church. Well, is that true? Is that not true?
So this is scholars have discussed.
Yes, please.
Yes, it is true that the name of the church which she attached herself to is St. Julian.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the practice of anchorites to take the name of the church.
Okay.
And Julian was a girl's name in the 14th century. So it really just could have been a coincidence.
Just could have been a name.
In my story, it's a coincidence, and she's called Julian.
I love that.
So yes, we
don't know a huge amount about her, but the placement of her, we know that she was very, very sick, as you've already alluded to, but also that she was living around the time of the plague and all of this. So sickness and death and suffering, these were things that were very real to Julian, and so. I'm not going to quote her most famous quote yet. That is too soon in the conversation for that. But I think what I'm wondering is how, and through your experience with her, how would Julian define joy, do you think, in regards to all of the pain she had been through?
She would say it's on the other side of the pain, or it's through the pain. This is what was so important about the way she helped me with the cancer, is enter it. This is the crucifixion and resurrection, and this is what she saw in her visions and describes in her book. You find it on the other side of pain. And it is there. And it's rich and deep and true.
I wrote a piece recently about Nick Cave's latest album, Wild God, and in it I said that it feels like he made this album out of the same stuff that Julian of Norwich wrote Revelations of Divine Love about. Both in the way that I meant it then was more that there's this freedom about them both to not correctness, I'm in quotation marks, wasn't their primary aim. And so there was a real freedom about that, because it meant that they were talking about God in bold ways and creative ways, and ways that maybe, if you want to make something academically bulletproof, you wouldn't speak about God in those terms. So that, but the way you're speaking as well, his whole album, this, Nick Cave tragically lost 2 sons recently, one of them in horrific circumstances. And he wrote in one of his Red Hand Files that he almost called the album Joy, even though it's laced with grief. So that's really, as you're speaking, it feels like it's made of the same stuff.
Yes,
like the real
exactly.
stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's beautiful.
One line from the book in Julian says, "I am inside my cell and inside myself, but I am not withdrawn. I am open, porous." It's an interesting phrase, porous. What do you mean by that? What were you trying to express through Julian?
My whole doctorate was about that.
Yes.
Porosity, restoring porosity, that she shows us by the nature of her writing, by the way she responded to her visions and then the way she wrote about her visions. She offers us the opportunity to shed our buffered self. That's a word from Charles Taylor. And find again that in us which is inherently social, connected, interdependent. And this is how to respond to the environment today. This is the mindset or the subjectivity we should bring to our interaction with the environment today in order to find a way for humans to live on the earth without harming it. So it's a response of service and discipleship, not control and objectifying. So porosity is a really important concept to me, and I think it's a really important concept for today. But the lovely thing about the cell is, so yes, she goes in, she's bricked in, she stays in for all of her life. That's the promise that she makes, the vow that she makes. But it has 3 windows. It has a squint so that she can look at the high altar. She can't see the church itself, the body of the church, but she can see the high altar. And it's a gap so she can receive communion. There's a window for her maid who would bring food and take away waste. And there's a window onto the street. And to that window came people who sought her counsel. And we have a first-hand account of that from someone called Marjorie Kemp, which is one of the reasons we know there was an anchorite called Julian in Norwich at the time. And so people would come. And news would come too. So there she is, and this, you can imagine this little light in the middle of a land which is ravaged by the pestilence, as they called it, wave after wave after wave, but also war and social uprisings. This is the time of the Peasants' Revolt and Wat Tyler.
Okay.
Of the growth of Lollardy, so proto-Protestantism, and a fearful church looking for heretics, and the Bishop of Norwich in particular, Henry le Despencer, who'd fought a crusade and some other wars for the king and for the Pope. Once he sort of brought his bellicosity back, and now he was looking for heretics. And so you can imagine that would be another reason why Julian might want to tuck herself away, because she wanted to reflect on these things. So there she is. And also the writing of the text. So all these porosities, if you like. The cell itself is porous. She's received these visions from the Almighty, which is open to everything. And she's going to write about them. And she has to understand, or in my story, and I think it's plausible, that they may never be read. What she writes may never be read. But the idea is that it will be read, and she refers again and again in the text to her fellow Christians, her even Christians. These are we readers who will have the chance to have the encounter that she had. So she's porous to her, to so much to her readers in the case of the writing, but to her maid and church and everyone who came to visit her and all that news. And people asking her, what about all of this? So she wasn't disconnected in any way.
I am just popping in to invite you to be a part of our Seen and Unseen community. You can have Seen and Unseen sent straight to your inbox. On Tuesdays, our editors give a weekly roundup of things that have caught their eye in culture, current affairs, trends, all of it. On Fridays, you will have the best of Seen and Unseen articles delivered directly to your inbox. And you will also be first to know about any events that we have
coming up. So head to seenandunseen.com to subscribe.
Now, you found yourself attracted to Julian. Funnily enough, just this summer I read a book by a woman called Donna Freitas, who sort of is all about her Catholic upbringing, but how she lost her faith and how she's sort of always been on the lookout, trying to find God again, basically. But in amongst all the experiences she had that kind of put her off church, she sort of pursued a sort of doctorate herself in theology. And the one thing that kind of came to her rescue that kind of made her think there might be something in this was, funnily enough, Julian of Norwich and the female mystics and the medieval. And it was so interesting to read that and then read your book. And I just wonder, what is it about Julian of Norwich that appeals even to a skeptic like her? She would say, I'm absolutely skeptical about God and religion, but somehow Julian of Norwich broke through the firewall and kind of made me willing to kind of give it a second look.
It's disarming writing.
Right.
It's like poetry. It does something to you. And it's not to be read critically, actually. That would miss the point entirely. It's to be received and like it as a disciple, received porously, and if you're open, that's what she'll do. She'll get it, you know. and it is, as you were saying, it's so free. So it's disarming. She doesn't try to organise God. She's not trying to tell us who God is, or she just says, this is what I saw. And it's not what Holy Church teaches, but she also doesn't jettison Holy Church, which is quite impressive. Yeah. So, yeah, she's a real, that's the last thing she'd call herself, but she is a real teacher, transformative teacher.
Yeah. Because a lot of people these days are trying, if they are Christians, are often invested in trying to make Christianity relevant to the modern world, 21st century world. And one of the ways people try to do that is to present it in very rational terms, and say, look, here's an argument for God, here's scientific evidence for God, here's, it almost feels like Julian of Norwich is not that, certainly. And to that extent, I don't know, but I sometimes wonder whether we've fallen into the trap of the Enlightenment and the sort of Reformation of sort of going down a very left-brained way of trying to interpret and understand God. And that's actually not the way most people actually really encounter God. No. So I don't know, is there space for Julian to kind of come back at this point to a very, skeptical, rationalistic culture? Is there a space for Julian to speak to us?
I'd say, as I say, she's disarming. And this Enlightenment mindset, and this is precisely the thing, it seems to me, that needs to be let go of, melted, because it's that, look, so many good things came out of it, but it is what's killing the planet. It's notion of other, of control, of objectifying, of rationality, or rationalizing. I'm not saying we don't need, I'm absolutely not saying we don't need science. It's more the attitude that we bring to technology, let's say. Not the technology itself, but the attitude we bring to it. And Julian just doesn't have that attitude. And I feel this huge thirst for depth that the rational approach cannot give us, apart from a certain frisson of enjoyment at a really good argument, really well argued thing. This is something else again, and it's not going to be reached through rational argument. This was a bit like the work we did at Westminster Abbey Institute with our public servants, with politicians and civil servants and other public servants, to give them the chance to breathe and reflect and reconnect to their vocation to public service. And these are all hard to, you can't measure it. Did it make people better public servants? Well, I believe so, but it's hard to say so. And I feel this hunger everywhere, or thirst. Yeah. And I think Julian is a drink for us today. And it is interesting that she is becoming more and more and more popular. She really disappeared until the 20th century when Grace Warwick rendered her text into modern English. Evelyn Underhill found her, introduced her to T.S. Eliot, who quoted her in Little Gidding. And from then on, from the second half of the 20th century onwards, she's just more and more and more in our consciousness, almost as if what she wrote back in the 14th century is for the 21st century, which isn't a million miles from the 14th century in terms of pestilence and unrest and war and everything.
Yeah, it's absolutely got a propheticness,
I'd say,
about it. In the last series of this, we spoke to Ian McGilchrist, and something he said, I mean, lots of things he said is great, but something he said stuck with me, where he said, we've got into a place where we think that if we can only speak about something poetically, it means it's not true. Whereas if you can only speak about something in a poetic way, it's probably a sign that it's the truest thing, because our language can't quite get close to it and our rationality is disarmed by it. And she has a touch of that.
She does.
I think, she goes to the deepest places of us. And because she does it in the way she does it, you kind of get this little niggle that everything she's saying is completely true. Do you know what I mean? Like in the deepest sense, which is really interesting, which is interesting when you think that it was going against some of what she said. So for example, she sort of attributes femininity to God and Jesus in a way that might have made the authorities uncomfortable. But it's that. It's like she bypasses so much within us. Speaking about the feminine, actually, what impact does it have that she is a woman, and that her writing? So, for example, she calls God and Jesus mother. She speaks of them as mother. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the feminine within Julian's work?
Yes. Yes, well, that. I gather from medieval scholars, it wasn't that unusual to attribute motherhood to God, actually.
Yeah.
So not necessarily that radical, that bit of her writing.
Right, okay.
But yes, so she sees, this famous vision. She sees the whole of the world as a hazelnut in her palm of her hand. And I always imagine it without its shell. She says it's round, it's a little ball the size of a hazelnut. And it's everything that's made. And she wonders how it can last. It's so fragile and so little. That's prophetic. And she says, and I understood in my ghostly, in my mind, that it was held together and it lasted because God loves it. So God cannot be wroth, because if God were wroth for 1 nanosecond, all that is made would fall. It's held by God's love. And she does then wrestle with sin. But you end up with this sense with God as mother. As a mother, you will forgive your child anything. I would say fathers too, actually, but it's just a feature of the mother. Yeah. As I was in Ireland a while ago, and a priest said, it's the mothers who keep visiting their sons in prison, decade after decade. It's the mothers who never give up. And so there's some sense of, and actually this is an image in Julian as well, of coming to your mother, and you've done wrong and you've hurt your knee and you're weeping, and she gathers you to her, and you just know the love will never go. So there's that beautiful quality that Julian really offers us about God. It's fabulous. Would a man have done it? I don't know, but I don't know. Men can write beautifully too in this soft way, but she certainly does. And I guess it's important, thinking of the person you were reading, Donna Freitas.
Donna Freitas,
yeah, for her, that she was a woman.
Yes, I think so. And I think it was, she almost saw some of those figures, females, speaking from within, obviously, the confines of their age, the medieval era, but almost as like the proto-feminists of their time, in a sense. They sort of said, actually, there's something about faith that can transcend even the obviously hugely patriarchal culture they were in, that they used what freedom they had to to sort of do something significant and reach beyond that. And there was almost, she describes it almost as, you know, these women kind of came with flaming swords, she once describes it as, to kind of just encourage her almost that we're here, we've always been here, and we're part of a sort of a sisterhood or whatever, you know, that goes down the ages. And it just gave her enough faith to kind of, if not quite able to believe in God and the Catholic faith, sort of not to completely reject it at that point. And I found that interesting that there was people like Julian of Norwich that enabled her to do that. I mean, turning again in a sense to our modern age, it seems like a very unlikely sort of figure to sort of potentially re-engage people spiritually. This very eccentric, esoteric woman who, you know, balled herself off for decades. I mean, I suppose the question is, what we live in a post-Christian culture, but one which seems to be in various ways still spiritually seeking. People often describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. I mean, what Julian experienced, passed on, and the sort of the things she felt and said, what could kind of a modern day secular person, but who's maybe looking for something, capture from that? Yes.
So that description you just gave of her as this eccentric, 700 years old, esoteric, walled herself up, that's a very left brain description.
And I was kind of very consciously sort of giving a bit of a caricature of that.
Indeed,
but yes.
Indeed. And so this book tried to, it's subversive. It gets in under the radar, perhaps, from above. So to say, as she does with her text, to say not, I'm going to deal with this rationally in any way, I'm just going to tell you what I saw. And that's there's an authenticity about that, isn't there? Why would she make things up when she's not actually trying to prove anything? She's simply saying what she saw. Incidentally, there's a beautiful scene at the end of her book when she talks about waking up after these 16 visions, and she wakes up and it's as if the crisis of her fever has passed. She wakes up and there's a religious person sitting by her bed. And he asks her how she fared, and she said, I raved today. I thought the cross bled. And this religious person doesn't laugh. She's laughing. He doesn't laugh. And he says, you should take that seriously. And so you get the sense if she hadn't had that encounter, we wouldn't have revelations of divine love, because she did not take herself seriously at all. Now, there was quite a bit of looking for visions going on at the time, not from Julian.
Okay.
Which, again, adds to this fresh, bloody hell, this has happened. And this is everything that's coming out of me that I'm understanding from what I saw. And I think our rationalist selves are just dying for something like that, which is confounding, which is so open-ended and porous and draws you forward to the unknown and the inexplicable. In her text, Julian talks about what she sees and then what Holy Church teaches, and they're not always the same thing. But she doesn't try and get rid of Holy Church or say Holy Church is wrong. In fact, she says, no, stay with Holy Church. So, and something that really helped me to write about that and understand it was something my father taught me when I was younger, which was if you're presented with two proposals, both of which have merit, but which are incompatible, don't jettison one of them. Hold them both in your mind, and your mind will grow.
Wow.
Such good advice, because of course we don't know everything. Of course there's mystery upon mystery or mystery. Scientists know that. There's always more to discover. So for heaven's sake, don't sort it out. So
it's not that Julian is sort of in competition with correct doctrine or whatever. It's that we should sort of hold them both and say, actually, there's a way of our mind growing to encompass both of these. And
in terms of our modern day and the church, I feel and I did really try and say this in the story, or hope it comes out in the story, not to jettison the organisation, however frustrating it is, because that's where we come together. That's our means of community. That's where the sacraments are expressed. That's where the possibility of transformation is offered together, which is not at all to say that the contemplative prayer, which, as it happens, is my preferred way of praying, not to say that's invalid, not at all. And the freedom of it, fantastic. But we do need each other. We really do. And however frustrating our organisations are, like the civil service or Parliament or the church, they are custodians of something. They kind of kill inspiration, but they're also custodians of it. We wouldn't have the Gospels if it weren't for the church.
Yeah,
So
sure.
We lose it at our peril, I feel.
Absolutely. Which is very interesting in this whole, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, which I'm seeing all over the place. And actually, that's my first question before I get into a second question, which just come into my mind, is, are you seeing that? Are you seeing a rise in mysticism, both within, but also outside of Christianity, a rise of this, you spoke about it yourself, this deep thirst, that is just so done with the left brain way of living life, to, talk in that way again. Just this kind of spiritual porousness.
Yes.
Returning. Are you seeing that?
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure we are. And I think it's wonderful and it's so heartfelt and it's so sincere. I don't think the church has got a clue how to. Well, I'm sure within the church there are plenty of people who do have a clue.
Yes,
I know plenty of people who do have a clue, but as an institution, it's really not answering that thirst. And so these poor people are wandering around and, here's something that sounds like it might be right. What about that? This is how this makes me feel. Lots and lots of self-help, which is partly an expression of that. How does it make you feel? So I think Julian can really help here. Really help.
As you say, that I think that the great difficulty with the spiritual but not religious sort of person is that they want a lot of the things that ultimately you can only get through religion, really. And it was interesting. I heard Nick Cave, funnily enough, as a modern day Julian of Norwich, maybe talking about this. He said, I'm not. I used to think of myself maybe as spiritual but not religious, but actually I've realised I need the religion bit because you can't. It's too amorphous otherwise. I need a container to sort of. So I need to sit in a church in order to kind of pray and to think and to and it's just interesting, isn't it, that we often want. But Julian had to. She was able to, in a sense, have the freedom she had because there was a church within which she was that mystic, who kind of was maybe on the edge of things and a bit unusual, but nonetheless, it's like she was still attached to, that literally her cell was attached to the church in that way. Yeah. I don't know. And so can we, I suppose a lot of people want the benefits of spirituality without the institutional religion, but can you have it one without the other? I don't know.
Well, for a long time, yes. And I also think that those who remain as within the fold, as it were, should get out.
Right.
And be generous in sharing and not make it contingent or conditional, just manifest it. That's what I felt the work we were doing at Westminster Abbey and also at St Paul's Cathedral. That's because its primary mission there is people come who don't even necessarily know it's a church. You just be generous and share. We have this such a phenomenal treasury, and it must be shared. And it's getting a bit rancid inside. So that's the first thing. And you know what? Then see what happens. It's to be attractive, not make requirements. And actually, don't change things too much to make it seem more. People know if you're not being authentic, but really be authentic in the worship and mean it. Yeah. So it's evident. Yeah. You can feel it. You can feel the joy, the light, the seriousness, the contrition, penitence, these things which are such important qualities of humanity that are needed and not necessarily expressed. We don't know how to express them.
Yeah, I don't know if I might have told this story on the podcast. Anyway, I went to Glastonbury this year, and it has a whole section of it called the Healing Fields, where you can go and it's absolutely jam-packed full of thousands of people, and you can try every spiritual experience you can possibly think of in these healing fields, and people do, like anything, and it's packed. And then on the other side of the site is the Glastonbury Church, and I was like, why isn't the Glastonbury Church right there, right in the centre of the healing fields, as if we've disqualified ourselves from being able to offer what these people are seeking, or that if they're seeking that, then that they're not our type of seekers. We'll have the ones, and it's really far up a hill as well. We'll have the ones who are willing to climb up this hill to come and find us. And it was just a bit that. And so if you're listening, Church of Glastonbury, put yourself in the healing fields. But we've kind of pulled ourselves to our peril, because now we're not the first place people go. But it's like we've pulled ourselves out of that as an option. We've stopped telling people that we are... I mean, me being a Christian, I think we're the option, but I'll just say a option for a minute. Like, we are a place where where this thirst can be quenched. We are a place where this craving for something more can absolutely be fulfilled. It's like we've almost forgotten that that's a part of our identity almost. Do you sense, and if we have done that, bring back Julian. Like, let's bring it back.
Yeah. I was just thinking about the Catholic priest in Hastings where I go. My husband's Catholic, and I have completely fallen in love with this priest, so I tend to go to Mass. And he has this quality of depth, even in his voice. He speaks quite slowly. The Catholic Mass is often quite fast. He speaks quite slowly, and there's always some silence in his homily where he leads us in a short meditation, but it brings us to some kind of stillness and depth, and his voice is really part of that experience, and his sincerity at the sacrament, so you're really held there as it's happening in this community of faithful people. Now that and people are coming in hordes. Actually,
that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
That.
I think that there is as you say, there's a thirst for something real, deep. I think we live in a very often facile culture, and it's only getting, with social media, ever more sort of clickbaity and sort of surface level. And I just wonder whether at the point where someone kind of encounters something deep and meaningful and serious almost, suddenly it wakes them up to sort of something they've been missing all along. And I suspect an encounter with Julian does that for some people who actually read, and I suspect your wonderful book is an entryway for people to kind of go to the source as well.
Absolutely.
I suppose the question is, to be a sort of someone who experiences God, do we have to have the kinds of experience Julian had, or was she a sort
visions?
of... Well, yeah.
Well, I hope not. I've never had a vision.
Well, I was going to say though, but and that might be the assumption some people, mistakenly go away with. To be spiritual, I have to kind of lock myself in a cell and meditate on God my whole life. But what would you say for the person who's seeking but is unlikely to have a Julian of Norwich experience? What might you kind of... Where might you suggest they start if they want, if it's unlocked something in them that says, I think I need something like that. I need something of that depth and seriousness and passion, that feels different to the culture I'm swimming in at the moment.
Well, it might be a book, or it might be a conversation. I would say, that feeling of deep satisfaction that some encounters bring, some conversations. Or it might be meditation, it might be looking out in nature, walking. That's where to start, in that feeling. And you can have a feeling memory of it. You can remember the feeling of it, because you can't necessarily manufacture these things, but you can return to that feeling and sit with it, and seek out the company which gives you that feeling of nourishment. Honestly, it's like the difference between eating fast food and really healthy food. Just the difference that you feel of the two experiences. One of them gives a kind of satisfaction. It's very slow living. It often leaves you hyper, makes you fat. But so it's the same. It's the equivalent. It's analogous. Go there and slow down. That's, I think, being in a hurry is a real. It's terrible for the planet. I know in myself. I like to think I'm an okay kind of person. If I'm in a hurry, I'm a monster. Everybody turns into an obstacle. I hate them. They're in the way.
Yes.
Everything you handle is just, and you just forget your interdependence. And so slow down, slow down.
And is it significant that not only was obviously your cancer treatment the kind of catalyst for thinking, well, I want to lean into sort of Julian, but also I think COVID and that sort of sense in which that forced everyone, at least for a while, to slow down and had a sort of sense of isolation as well. There have just been little reminders, haven't there, to people that actually there might be a different way of doing life. And we sort of, and what seems bizarre to us, Julian, breaking herself up in a cell for years on end, that there's some kind of freedom actually in being able to do that, being able to inhabit a mind where you don't have to have a million different distractions to be able to get by.
Yes. So as a writer, this was a great challenge. I was going to write a story about a woman who didn't go anywhere.
Yes.
Literally didn't go anywhere. How was that going to be a page turner? And so the thought was, well, look,
when you say it like that,
the interior journey is so dramatic. Yep. Anyone who's taken this seriously, and I remember the monastery where I go on retreat each year. Brother George told me he was having a conversation with somebody, I can't remember the context, who said, "Isn't it really boring? You do the same things every day." And George said, that film, The African Queen. He said it's like that, only much, much more dramatic. And he's right. And so to tell this interior story, to show the drama of it, it's so if you're used to it's constant simulation, which we are, this is the absolute opposite. But to make it a page turner, that was my challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope I've done it.
I think you have.
You absolutely have. The other thing I find incredibly encouraging about Julian of Norwich, in regards to your question, like where do we start, how do we access this, is I love that she had these visions and she spent her life pondering them and kind of asking God for a bit more clarification and things like that. And I think I find that very encouraging, because I can have a feeling or have something that I think might be from God. I can't make sense of it, so I put it in the bin and I move on. So I think it's that as well, isn't it? Is just the bravery to have something and then sit in it. Yeah. And think, I'll just keep asking and I'll keep thinking about it and I'll keep pondering. Maybe I'll write it down, like I'll externally process it until I don't want to say until it makes sense, because that gets a bit too stretching it on the rack again. But until I feel confident that God has spoken. I find that really encouraging about Julian. Yeah. And again, that's so countercultural. Yeah. So
it is, where you have to sort of have some product or result,
quickly.
Yeah,
like tie a bow
measurably.
on it. Tie a bow on it. Yeah.
It's unlikely, with all due respect to the Church of England, that they're going to, fund a Julian of Norwich, to just sit there in a cell and sort of think about.
But you'd have to find her first.
Well, exactly. Yes, that it's hard to imagine that. But I mean, these are all kind of aspects of the modern age that we're living in, and I suppose it is that sense of, okay, we can't maybe put the genie back in the bottle. We can't go back to the 14th century and inhabit exactly what they did then. But are you hopeful that people will? What are you hoping people will be inspired at least by reading this sort of first-person account of this extraordinary woman and the visions she had and the way they spoke to her and obviously now speak to many people since?
I would hope that you would then be less afraid to look inside. You'd be less afraid to stand still and wait.
I like that.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
That there is, of course, what you mentioned earlier, Belle,
The
the well-known phrase used by T.S. Eliot that many people may be familiar with: all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. So that might be the one bit, and I'll put my hand up to this before reading your book, that I knew that was attributed to Julian of Norwich. Why is that particularly, that phrase stuck, and what do you think Julian of Norwich, how did she get to that kind of place?
Sin is behovely, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well.
People chop off that first bit, don't they? Yeah.
It's very poetic, so it's memorable. That's one aspect of it. There is something deeply comforting about it. And you know when something can be a platitude or it can be true and it's the same sentence?
Yes.
Well, Julian and also T.S. Eliot, if you like, earned the right to say, all shall be well. T.S. Eliot was writing Little Gidding in the 30s, early 40s. It's Second World War, Nazism, horrific things happening. And he really confronted that. His spirituality in Little Gidding it's all very Julian, actually. It's not just that he quotes her. It's got a real sense of her spirituality, and it's like the joy that comes on the other end of the pain. So, sin is behovely, or these things will happen. These things which are so hard, all of us will face travail. All of us, in one way or another. Move through it, because all shall be well.
It's not something that will mean much if you're just trying to arrive there without the bit that often gets chopped off, the fact that life is difficult.
It won't last if you're just trying to get there. That's the... I think this spiritual, not religious, is really sincere, and I don't knock it at all. But it's infected by this quick result idea.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't last. A feeling of well-being. You have an amazing meditation and then never again. How do you package it? How do you make it keep? You just can't. It has to be earned. And it's life which will teach it to you. And God, we would say, but it's not a construction. So all shall be well. If you think what Julian was living through, what we're living through, all shall be well. It's Nick Cave who said, hope is optimism with a broken heart. That's the quality of it.
Absolutely. Claire, I think you might be my new favourite person in the world.
Or Julian is.
Well, no, but that's the thing, is like, you said it about Julian, but it's like through your book, you've said, don't look at me, look at here. And then through her writings, she says, don't look at me, look at God. So it's like this absolute funnel through which you just get to like this true beautiful thing. And it's just such a gift. You are such a gift. Julian is such a gift. The partnership between you is a match made in heaven. So, everything about it is re-enchanting.
Yeah, we love it.
Highly
recommended.
Yes.
I, Julian.
We'll
make sure there's a link from today's show.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in and re-enchanting us.
Thank you for your questions. What a fabulous conversation. Now, that makes us nourished. We feel nourished from this conversation.
Absolutely.
That's what we need.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for watching and listening as well. If you want more from Re-Enchanting, do go to seenandunseen.com. And if you want to support these conversations and more of these kinds of episodes, then feel free to tap the give icon as well. We would love your support. But for now, from myself and Belle, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being with us, Claire.
Thank you.